Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, March 20th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the general election matchup between President Biden and President Trump in the 2024 presidential race. Now, what I have noticed over the past couple of weeks now is that we have a lack of pushed polling. What I mean by that is when we take a look at our general election matchup between Trump and Biden here, a lot of voters are just simply undecided. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that so many voters out there are really just unhappy with the fact that we're in a position where it is Donald Trump and Joe Biden again. They're seeing a rematch of the 2020 presidential election and just quite frankly don't want to take a stance and do not want to make a choice between these two candidates here. And so it's been a while that we've seen any polls really push people to think deeper, stop the undecided, and just decide who you're going to vote for if you were presented with these two options today. And I think they actually show us a very, very different and interesting result, something we might be able to expect or might see this coming November that the polls right now just don't seem to be capturing. And so what you might notice here is that taking a look at the spread, Donald Trump is ahead by roughly 2 percentage points. The most recent poll from Grinnell College and Seltzer, which is a very, very reputable poll, they actually do very good things when it comes down to accurate polling and getting the numbers correct. They show Donald Trump with a 7-point advantage. Now, what is consistent here is that Donald Trump leads in the overwhelming majority of these polls, and historically for the past month or two has been as well. But what you might notice is that in 2 out of the 3 polls here that show Joe Biden with an advantage that is larger than 1 point, even the only 2 polls that do that, the 2-point advantage here, what seemingly is when voters do not have another option besides Trump or Biden and are forced to choose between the two here. Joe Biden leads by 2 points amongst the poll with Reuters and Ipsos, and Emerson College also shows a poll here with Joe Biden with an advantage point of 2 points. And so the question for me is, why is it that these leads are for Joe Biden and not in any of the other polls? And my answer can actually be there when you take a closer look at some of these polls. We'll first start off with Reuters and Ipsos, which at the very, very start with their poll here, they showed that roughly 39% of registered voters said they would vote for Joe Biden if the election was held today, compared to just 38% with former President Trump. And so you might be thinking, okay, 39 to 38, it's not phenomenal for Joe Biden, but it's better than what some of the other polls are telling us. And for that, I'll give you that. But 39 to 38% for two people who have already been on the national stage, have both gone through an election against each other, and this is Donald Trump's 3rd time and his 3rd go-around, really, for the presidency, or 4th time, depending on if you count his 2000 presidential run. But regardless, 3rd time going around for the presidency, and you find that 22%, 23% of this country is undecided. So what Reuters did was, I think, very, very smart. A lot of polls really do not do this here because we are a little bit further out from the election than we typically start general election polling, at least to this scale, and have it so defined. I think 2020 around this time, we generally knew that Joe Biden would be the nominee, and so general election season started to ramp up at this point. But what we found there, and what we find in this poll, is that so many voters are undecided, and a significant number saying they're going to choose other candidates, but they don't know the other candidates. They don't name other candidates. It's very similar to what we saw in 2016, where there was a huge chunk of polling for third-party candidates that didn't necessarily translate into strong performances in elections, with very, very minimal exceptions like Utah and New Mexico. Other than that, the third-party candidates in 2016 really didn't make most of the moment and really didn't do as well as the polls had predicted. And that's largely because voters, when they get to the ballot box, do end up realizing that we are in a two-party system. Do end up realizing that the only two candidates who are going to win the presidency are Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And that's exactly what Reuters and Ipsos did here to push voters to make a decision. They didn't believe that 23% were genuinely undecided, and they also knew that these 23% of voters absolutely had an opinion. So what did they do? They asked them, if the race was between the two candidates here, and we were to face them off against each other, just head to head, and you had to vote today, who would you choose? Well, 2% still said, I'm refusing to answer the question. But that's a significant dip from 23% amongst this same group. Biden ended up leading 50 to 48. Instead of 39 to 38, it was 50 to 48. Interesting. Joe Biden's lead increased and reached a majority when voters were forced to choose between him and Trump. And so for me, when that first came out, I looked at it and said, okay, this could be the start of something, but I need another poll to back this up. I need another data point for me to look at and say, you know what? Maybe this is how things go. And then came Emerson College. They did a poll that showed Donald Trump and Joe Biden tied. And when this headline was initially released, I said, okay, throw it in the average. This is similar to the ones we're seeing. They didn't really do anything interesting in this poll, so there's not much more to really dissect and unpack other than the status quo that Donald Trump has been leading. But what you might notice here on the Real Clear polling page is that Joe Biden leads by 2 points amongst Emerson College. And so Emerson College, with their poll, which arguably, was released before the one from Reuters and Ipsos. But again, the headlines here were that it was a tie. No one really dived deeper into it until there was a reason to look deeper and look through some of the other polls, which honestly, many of them just simply do not press voters out and ask them to make a decision between the top two. Granted, we are months and months away from the general election, so you don't need to be asking those questions or really forcing people to choose when we don't know guaranteed who's going to be on the ballot in certain states from, third-party candidates and who's going to be, VP for Donald Trump. I get it. I see the reason. I see, the reason not to force voters to choose. But what I found here was interesting that when they did have to choose, it wasn't that it was a tie between Trump and Biden. When they had to make a decision between the two candidates, Biden ended up winning by 50, with 50% of the support here, 51 to 49. It was a 2-point advantage for President Biden. And it was a lead that genuinely, I think, was a bit more surprising for me. Because I didn't necessarily think that, this tied group, 45 to 45, would eventually break for Biden. What we remember back from 2020 was that a crap ton of independent voters and voters that were out there saying, I'm undecided between the two candidates, eventually ended up breaking for Donald Trump. What you found was that a lot of them, based on the polls here, 51.2 to 51.4 for Biden, ended up moving over into the Trump column. But in 2022, that was thrown completely to the side. So many of those undecided voters in the Senate races and the governor races ended up voting Democrat, in some cases by 8-2, right? A 4-1 margin of voters in the undecided column breaking for the Democratic Party. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen in the Trump era, and yet it was something that made sense following the Dobbs decision. And made sense given that the enthusiasm around President Biden was so low, the enthusiasm around the Democratic Party was so low. And yet, when it came to the ballot box, Democrats did significantly better than anyone even expected, because these voters here weren't public about their support for Democrats, weren't telling the pollsters they were voting for Democrats, but quietly were, because they cared about issues like abortion. They quietly agreed with the Biden agenda. They thought that Democrats would be better to govern their state, to represent them in the Senate, to represent them in the House, and these are things that we look at and say, these election results are above all else. It isn't polling that we can blindly follow, but they do provide indicators, and what these polls in specific do, different from all of the others, is that they make voters choose between the top two. In the most realistic way possible, they are emulating what it would be like in the ballot box rather than leaving up 20+% of this country or 15% plus undecided. Because what we know genuinely is that 15% to 20% of this country is not undecided between Biden and Trump. They've made this decision before. They've seen Trump twice now, against Hillary Clinton, against Joe Biden, and now he's up against Biden again. It's the first presidential rematch we've seen since 1956. This is not historical precedent. This is something that voters know these candidates well, know these presidents well. And so for 15 to 20% of this country to genuinely be undecided, I don't buy it. And neither should you. When you're taking a look at these numbers here, the reason why Biden does well is because when push comes to shove, these voters vote blue. They are unhappy with President Biden and right now are saying, I don't agree with his, take on what's happening in the Middle East. I don't agree with his take with what's happening at the southern border. But on issues like abortion and student loan debt and prescription drugs, they might align with him and they might quietly vote for him. And I think what you're finding here too is because there now is movements from the left to abandon President Biden, to push against him, to not vote in the election or at least not vote on the presidential. There is now a societal pressure point on the left side that it is now, in some cases, socially ostracizing to vote for Biden and publicly be pro-Biden. When you look at some of these regions of the country, for instance, some of the most left-wing parts and also regions like Detroit, Dearborn, with a heavy Arab community, where issues like what's happening in the Middle East are very, very prevalent to voters there and matter a lot. And you have this abandoned Biden movement. So when all of a sudden people are coming out there in support of Biden, canvassing for him, advocating for him, they are looked at as if, they are in opposition to the issue points, to the policy stances of these communities, even if they align on 95% of other issues. And so that's what's interesting about this. While there may be a silent Trump vote again, I wouldn't ignore the fact that we are seeing clear-cut data here that there are silent Biden voters. That when just asked the question, plainly put, Biden isn't getting as large of a lead as he does when voters actually make the decision. The headline here is that Trump and Biden are tied, but in reality, they aren't. When voters get to that ballot box, in reality, they know it's the top two contenders here, and I'm sure there will be some third-party votes, but I don't think it'll be like 2016, and I do think that the average American voter, when they get to the ballot box, we've seen this time and time again, the numbers never reflect the low numbers in the polls. They almost always underestimate the total vote share, because if things were dictated as the polls are, just like this one, only 90% of voters here would be voting for Trump or Biden, and I don't buy that for a minute. And so what I think we're going to see happen here is similar to what we've seen in Reuters and Emerson College, is that when push comes to shove, Biden is going to do better. And it's even happened here in swing states. Now, Donald Trump still leads in Nevada. Don't get me wrong on that point. But what we see in Nevada is that although there may be, this 3-point advantage for Emerson College here, when push comes to shove, Emerson College reveals that Trump's lead is narrowed down to 2 points. It used to be 7 points. On top of that, regardless, a 2-point advantage here for President Trump, but it is narrow. Biden's at 49%, not at 41%. Trump is at 51%, not at 44%. And while this may not be the best numbers the Democrats are looking for, the headline here is Trump is ahead by 3. In reality, he's ahead by 2, and it's very close. A 1.5% shift in the leftward direction makes Nevada blue. You don't get that from headlines like these, from the lack of, a deeper dive in these polls here. What it reveals is that when voters are forced with these two as their options, because they are their options, it sort of reminds voters that, hey, we're in a two-party system, and yes, it is Trump and Biden again. Biden and his campaign for a while now have been trying to remind voters that it is going to be a rematch election. And I think voters are finally aware of that. Now, Biden hasn't seen significant upticks in numbers, but he has seen an increase since Donald Trump and Joe Biden have won their nominations. And with that, I think voters are reverting back to their priors. It's not an overnight thing. Biden is not all of a sudden going to turn around this election, which I will acknowledge he currently is losing against Donald Trump. It's not going to happen overnight. What it's going to do, and what is necessary for this to happen, is to have consistent messaging here that can win over voters the same way they were won over back in 2020. That this is a lesser of two evils situation. That you need to do everything you can to prevent Donald Trump, not necessarily vote for Joe Biden. That's what was the argument back in 2020. And it worked. Effectively, might I add. Biden flipped Georgia for the first time since 92, Arizona for the first time since 96. And so when voters are in this position and realize that it is Trump and Biden again, I genuinely believe it because we've seen it in data points in swing states. On the national level, Biden will see an improvement. And I think it will be much more reflective of what we will actually see on Election Day. A Biden +2 victory in the popular vote is not too far off from probably what will happen, right? I think what we will see is Biden will win the popular vote by less than 2020, but still win the popular vote. And in some cases, I think he can win the Electoral College. I also think he could win the Electoral College without the popular vote, but it would take a lot of electioneering and winning over in swing states while abandoning some of the other states. And I think there would be negative repercussions for that in California's House races, in New York's House races. But regardless here, the presidency is the most important thing for Democrats. And I could see a reality in which Biden loses the popular vote and wins the Electoral College. I don't think that's likely, though. What I do think we are going to see is something similar to what we've seen with Emerson and Reuters. That when push comes to shove, Biden and Trump are in a lot closer of an election than we might think. I don't believe Trump has a 7-point advantage nationwide. I don't believe that he has an 8-point advantage nationwide. I think the average here is that Donald Trump is ahead, but of course, so many undecided voters, which again is a tough sell. Genuinely, a very tough sell that so many of these voters are undecided after already having made a decision in this election before. And so now I look at it and I just say that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party need to do this well. They need to remind voters of who this election is, but Democrats need to make it a two-way race. Republicans need to make it a multi-way race. They need to prop up somebody like RFK. They need to prop up other candidates like a Green Party candidate in those swing states or a Libertarian candidate even. I know that might seem surprising, but Democrats still see some reduction in support to Libertarian candidates there. Donald Trump is winning as is when these voters are undecided. But when they aren't undecided and they're forced to make a decision, that's when Biden thrives. And so I think we're going to see Democrats and Republicans adopt different strategies to make Biden and Trump the only race on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, make it a multi-way race, because that is how they win. That is how they've been winning. Democrats have a different strategy, a different approach, but now the numbers tell us exactly where the Biden victory lies. It lies in a two-way race in these swing states, on these national levels. This is how Biden wins. And when push comes to shove, the American public evidently does in fact choose President Biden, contrary to what we might have been hearing from the media, what these averages might be saying. But I have to remind you here, and you can genuinely believe me on this one, no 10% plus of this country is not undecided in an election they have already seen and voted in. And that is how I will leave you. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.